So welcome to Book at Lunchtime. My name's Christine Gerard. I'm the director of Torch, not so new now, but I was new at the start of the year. And today we're privileged to welcome Dr. Janina Ramirez to discuss her best-selling book, FEMINA. So for those of you who, I think many of you are regulars here, but for those of you who are not regulars and haven't been here before, Book at Lunchtime is a long-standing Torch event. We have some great books. And this event has been going on for, well, we're now in the 11th year. And all of these discussions are recorded. And we have had some terrific and really diverse books. They're always great. But this book today is particularly great. And we are very, very pleased to be able to welcome Janina and Professor Jane Shaw. Jane is the principal of Harris Manchester College and herself is, of course, an esteemed author. In fact, I've met Jane before because I spent a time as interim principal at LMH, so we met in a different relationship at that time. But I've never had the privilege of meeting Janina. And I have to tell you that I am a huge fan of her, particularly on television. So I often sit glued to the television set watching her, you know. And so it's so exciting to have her here in person. FEMINA has been the subject of many wonderful reviews since its publication. I think one that sums it up best, perhaps, is hidden on the back cover. FEMINA is a groundbreaking history of the Middle Ages. So we're really looking forward to having two authors of such stature to discuss this book. And with that, I will just hand over to you both. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, so just to be clear, I'm Jane, this is Janina. And it's one of the most wonderful appointments we've made in my time as principal of Harris Manchester College is Janina as a research fellow. She's just brilliant. She's just brilliant. Such a wonderful part of our community, and she looks after our historians of art as well. But as you will have realised, Janina, well, I call her Nina, is a person of enormous brilliance and great energy, and she's a force for much good in college, so we love that. I thought I'd just tell you a few little things about her before I invite her to read from the book. The first is that she read English at Oxford, at St Anne's College, and during that time was in a punk band. But happily, she decided to finish her degree rather than go touring with the band.
Yep. They didn't forgive me.
We are very, very grateful for that, because look at this amazing career that has flourished. She did her PhD at the University of York. She's written on Anglo-Saxon saints, goddess figures, the mystic Julian of Norwich, Beowulf, and of course, most recently, this wonderful book, FEMINA, which we're going to talk today, which was an instant Sunday Times bestseller when it was published in summer 2022 and was Waterstone's non-fiction book of the month exactly a year ago, last April, and then Waterstone's book of the year, which is an amazing achievement. And as Christine indicated, Janina is also a brilliant and enthusiastic broadcaster, and you will have seen her in some of her many excellent television programmes on subjects ranging from Tutankhamun to the Viking sagas to Sutton Hoo and much more. So that's a little picture of the amazing Janina.
My goodness, Jane, can I just take you everywhere? And when I'm feeling a bit low, can you read that out?
She's also Professor of Medieval History at the University of Lincoln. So we have to share her with the University of Lincoln, but she's also doing great things there, not just in the university, but also with the community and in what she calls cultural diplomacy, getting people to talk to each other through culture, which is and the arts, which is an amazing thing.
Wow. Wow.
So off you go. Why don't you read a little bit of the book?
Shall I?
Yes,
Shall I?
Yes.
Well, firstly, thank you all so much for coming along, for these incredible introductions. This is an extremely personal moment for me because, as Jane said, I did read English at St Anne's just across the road. And in fact, I was in here in this building when it was still a hospital when I accidentally cut my thumb off. So, and when I was walking from my car down to here, holding my book, knowing I'd be with my dear friend and principal of my college, talking to you all at Torch, which, I mean, I can't overemphasize how important Torch is and how much it means to me to have the humanities coming out to the public in the way that Torch does. It was a really magical moment. So I've had a little bit of a kind of teary moment walking down the street to get to you all. Thank you.
Can I just sum that out as a from chopped off thumb to best-selling book?
Yeah, the brain goes in funny directions. Okay, I will read a little bit, but I think I'm just going to read from the beginning, from the preface, because I think it's in this preface. I wrote this last in the whole process, and to me, it's sort of the manifesto of the book, really. Okay, this book comes with no apology. I am not here to convince you that it's high time we put women back at the centre of history. Many have done this before me. I'm also not here to draw a dividing line between male and female, to stress the importance of each in opposition to the other. Instead, I want to show you that there are so many more ways to approach history now. Far from being unrecoverable, developments in archaeology, advancements in technology, and an openness to new angles have made medieval women ripe for rediscovery. I'm not rewriting history. I'm using the same facts, figures, events, and evidence that we've always had access to, combined with recent advances and discoveries. The difference is that I'm shifting the focus. The frame is now on female rather than male characters. Both perform in the narratives, and we can only truly understand one in relation to the other. This book is about individuals rich in their complexity and fascinating in their variety. It's also about societies, groups of individuals working together and against one another, alongside a backdrop of shifting politics, economics, beliefs, and power. Approaching the past through women's lives and stories offers a unique prism through which to find new and overlooked perspectives. Women have always made up roughly half the global population. Why then should they not inform the way we perceive the past? We know so much about the rich and powerful few, but what about the poor and impoverished many? The very old and the very young are often ignored too. Disabilities are not a modern phenomenon, and neither are issues surrounding sexuality and gender. Yet we read so little about these areas in history books. Great progress has been made to understand the historical aspects of race and immigration recently, but there is still a long way to go. The medieval world was fluid, cosmopolitan, mobile, and outward-looking. Every major city would have been full of individuals of different skin colours, ages, backgrounds, religions, and heritage. Let's put them back into the history books too. There are so many overlooked periods, groups, and individuals that can enrich our relationships with the past. And it's in this spirit that I offer up this work. It's the start of a conversation, and I encourage every one of you reading it to join in. There are numerous unexplored avenues and tantalising roads less trodden. History is organic, and the way we engage with it grows and changes. But how individuals have written history reflects the time in which they write as much as the time they are writing about. Repackaging the past can influence the present. In times of colonial expansion, when support for the slave trade was required, the historian fed readers tales of explorers and conquerors. When soldiers were needed, ready to die for king and country, the historian gave them heroes and warriors. When society favoured male dominance and female subservience, the historian provided male-oriented history. But what about writing history now, at a time when so many are striving for greater equality? Can looking backwards impact how we look forward? Finding empowered women with agency from the medieval period is my way of shifting gear, providing new narratives for readers today. I know it carries bias, as all history is by its very nature subjective, no matter how objective we try to be. But through these remarkable women, I hope to show how we can effectively scrutinise historical evidence in more inclusive ways and engage with the past through fresh eyes. You cannot be what you cannot see. So let's find ourselves in what has gone before and reframe what we value going forward. Thank you.
So I was asked to just make a brief response to the book, which I will. And I don't want to talk for too long because we really want you to talk, not me. But I thought I'd raise a few themes that I think are particularly fascinating. And first of all, this is a wonderful book. If you haven't read it yet, you must. It is, as Janina says, a history of the Middle Ages from the perspective of women. But I think it's more than that. I think it's also a history, and you talk about this, that reminds us that our views of women and gender are very much informed by the modern period, particularly by the 19th century. The notion of women and men as two genders in separate spheres, public and private, from which women had to emerge. They had to emerge from the private sphere to enter the workforce in the public sphere. But that wasn't always the story, and I think Janina shows it was quite different. A different picture emerges in the Middle Ages. Now, interestingly, the suffragettes knew this. And the opening of the book starts after that preface with Emily Wilding Davison throwing herself in front of the horse. We don't really know why. But what I didn't know, actually, until I read Janina's book, is that Emily Davison was an incredible medievalist. She would have, if she'd been allowed to get a degree, she'd have got a first-class degree at St. Hugh's, much inspired by Joan of Arc. So they knew it, and we might talk a bit about that. There was also a lot of early 20th century women were very keen on recovering the medieval women, such as Marjorie Kemp, for example, usually celebrated for being the first woman to write a book in English, for her gift of mystical tears on her pilgrimages, not always appreciated by her fellow pilgrims. But she emerges not only as a mystic and a writer in Janina's book, but also as a woman who was at the heart of the merchant class and business world of 15th century Lynn, later King's Lynn in Norfolk. Likewise, Hildegard of Bingen, another visionary, not only that, but also a musician, a composer, an artist, a linguist, a scientist, great knowledge of medicine, and a highly capable administrator who's running these abbeys. And indeed monasteries, nunneries, abbeys, double monasteries that had both men and women in them, are places where women could exercise great power as abbesses, and therefore often in a way that we can't realise, perhaps from our own modern point of view, they exercise power in the wider community as decision makers. So, for example, in 8th century Mercia, which was the greatest of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, monasteries were often founded by the royal family and were therefore intimately connected to networks of power. In the said Mercia, Queen, how do we pronounce her name?
Cynethia.
Thank you. I'm glad you said that.
Sounds like a sneeze.
Yes, was a very important figure because she ruled jointly with her husband for over 35 years.
Who everyone will know, who is King Offa.
Yes, King Offa.
And what's so frustrating is everybody knows the name Offa, no one knows the name Cynethia.
But she was on the coin.
She was on the
very
coin.
importantly, just
Exactly.
as her contemporary Empress Irene was in 8th century Constantinople. And that's another thing about the book. The geographical reach is huge too. It is in many ways a global history. The book is also populated with warrior women, like the Burqa warrior whom we discovered. Well, the Burqa warrior is surrounded in their grave by weapons and a pair of horses at their feet in the grave. And I'm using a neutral pronoun deliberately because it was only in 2017 that DNA tests in labs in Stockholm revealed that the Burqa warrior was a woman. So that upends some of our assumptions about the Viking world. And in the same year, 2017, a set of 7,000 clay fragments was found in the Danish trading town of Ribbe.
Yep, very good.
Thank you. Another Viking settlement, like Burqa. And when pieced together, those clay fragments, we're not quite sure, I think, what they're used for, but they reveal a kind of gender fluidity. There's a bearded man with long hair whose gestures are associated with women, a woman in a dress, but she's carrying a shield and a sword, so she wouldn't be fighting in a dress, but she's got, or she might not have been. But were they associated with specific rituals and ceremonies, these figures? We don't know. But they tell us something interesting about gender. So Nina also obviously therefore draws on the ways in which research and knowledge is changing because of new technology, and we might talk a bit more about that. And it's important because the written sources can only tell us so much. The very title of the book reminds us of this. The word femina was scrawled on manuscripts in monastery libraries in the Protestant Reformation by the reformers who were sweeping through monasteries deciding which manuscripts or texts deserved keeping. Femina meant it was written by a woman and probably therefore not worth preserving. So we don't know how much medieval women's writing has survived, how much of the survival is, and some of that survival I should say is due to later generations of women.
Yeah.
And you might indeed tell us the story of the brave rescue of Hildegard of Bingen's manuscripts by two women, one American, one German, after World War II.
Yeah.
So most of all, this is a book of great stories, compellingly told, asking us to reconsider our presuppositions about women, about the Middle Ages, about how we do history, and much more. So that's a sort of quick cook's tour, if you like.
Goodness me. Well, can I just start by saying thank you, Jane? The idea that somebody like you, so esteemed, such a brilliant person, has taken the time to read my book, it humbles me. So thank you.
My pleasure. I've read it twice, actually.
It's absolutely incredible. I pinch myself. Yeah, there's lots of places to start.
So we start at the beginning of your book, which is Suffragettes and Medievalism.
Yeah.
Because that was new to me, and it might be new to a lot of you in the audience, but it's fascinating.
It's absolutely fascinating, and that was my eureka moment. I actually, I was doing, as us scholars do, I was chasing the rabbit hole of the footnotes and going off on one footnote and another, and I found one footnote reference to an article, sourced it, and in that one there was just a tiny little footnote that said Emily Wilding Davidson had studied medieval literature. She wrote over 200 articles, stories, tracts on medieval subjects, and that she called herself Fair Emily after Chaucer's character, and that it totally informed her life from childhood up to her death, which again I do make a case for in the book, she was modelling herself on one of Chaucer's stories where the bereaved women of the town come out and beseech the king on horseback to hear their petition. And nobody really knows why Emily Wilding Davidson walked out as she did underneath and was trampled by the king's horse. But that's a medieval practice of petitioning the king. And so was she just that imbued with it that it sort of influenced even her death? So I think your point's really important, Jane, that it's not just Emily. The medieval period was an inspiration for many suffragettes, and the banner of the suffragettes is Joan of Arc. Yeah. And you've got deeds, not words, but we've also got fight on and God will give the victory, which is Joan's words. So the reason for that, once I started to unpack it in my mind, it was quite a revolutionary thought, because what I suddenly realised was, as women, we tend to think now that we have these recently well-earned rights, thanks to the suffragettes, that our rights are 100 years old, and we are on this sort of upward ladder, this spiral of improvement, thanks to what the suffragettes did. And that is true. But the suffragettes couldn't project forward. They could only look backwards. And what they were looking backwards at was a recent phenomenon, a recent instance of the removal of women's rights. Yeah. And they wanted to get back before that, to a time that they saw an opportunity or opportunities for women. And that was the medieval period. And once that clicked in my head, I thought, goodness, it's almost, I hate to say it, but it's this feeling that we are the inheritors of something so recent makes me feel quite annoyed and angry, frankly.
So what about the religious women and their networks of power? Would you like to talk about some of them?
Oh, heavens, yes. So the book I wrote before this was called The Private Lives of Saints. And in that, that emerged out of my PhD, really. And I was very interested in bringing, because I was brought up Polish Irish Catholic, and I had this very weird thing about the saints, because in my grand's house, my Polish grand's house, if you wanted to get to the bathroom, you had to pass about 50 pictures of saints and bless yourself all the way down the hallway. And for me, saints were like these one-dimensional icons. They were these they're not earthly, they're not heavenly, they're somewhere between the two, these portals to the heavenly. But what I realised was that, of course, these people were living, breathing human beings, and they walked on the landscapes we can still walk on today, and they lived in the buildings we can still see today, and held objects we can still hold today. And I wanted to, and in many ways, the saints, as you'll know, Jane, is that the saints were the celebrities of their times. You have members of the royal family being made saints. You have people like Guthlac, who's in the moors fighting invisible demons, being made a saint. And they're people, they're notorious. They're people who draw other people to them. And I wanted to bring them to life. And in writing that book, I found particularly Hilda of Whitby. Yep. Who is amazing.
Yep, very powerful woman.
Very powerful. I mean, in terms of the work you do with theology, the role she reached was about as high as women could get in the church, wasn't it? Because she was leading that synod.
Yeah, she was. She was leading a synod for what the church would believe and what reforms might happen. But she's also in charge of a double monastery, so she's in charge of men and women.
Yeah, and a landowner and a member of the nobility. And then once I started to unpack Whitby and Hilda's environment in Whitby, that's what led me into this, because I start every chapter with a discovery, something recent that has helped propel forward our understanding of the field. And then I take you into the place, because I think that immersion in landscape, we forget, I think, about the power of being in a space where someone from the past has been. But that's what gets me excited. If you've ever seen any of my programmes, you can see the sheer glee when I'm sort of walking up an old medieval staircase or holding an old obsidian mirror. It's that connectivity to the past that gets me excited. And with Hilda, you get this very clear picture of a woman taking control of her destiny. Her very name means battler in Old English, and her earlier life, there's that magic number 33, which is the sort of, we're all 33 in heaven apparently, but she has 33 years of her life, which is just a way of saying halfway through her life, 33 years of her life as a princess of the Anglo-Saxon court. And then the other 33 years of her life as abbess, this saint, this leader of this double monastery. So for me, she sits at this crucial moment of change where one worldview, something very, very different, the pagan Anglo-Saxon warrior culture, the world of Beowulf, the world of Sutton Hoo, and she's got one foot there. And then she chooses to embrace this new, weird, exotic religion from another part of the world. Why? Because again, we tend to think of Catholicism in particular, the Catholic Church, as an institution that represses women, that keeps them down. But actually, for these early medieval women, they were seeing opportunities that they simply didn't have in this world, but they would have in the new world. And it was opportunities for learning, opportunities for sisterhood, creating these communities where women could work and create and make art and music and be very in these safe territories that were their own. It was an opportunity for land ownership, because a woman could found a monastery and then she could pass that on to her daughter. So it becomes a means of being a landowner, a property developer. And these monasteries, today we think about a monastery as quite a quiet place, but these were thriving, bustling mini cities, always by a river, always trading. The noise, the hammer, the clash of metalworking, the industry going on in manuscript production, the song, the noise, the hospital, they're learning medicine in these spaces. Once you start seeing them as these vibrant, loud, busy places, and then you see all these women that came out in the book at the head of it, in the heart of it, it makes me sad in a way that, and I found another big eureka moment was when I discovered that the origin of the phrase "a woman's place is in the home" was John Calvin, and that the redefinition of the gender realms was a result of the Reformation.
Yeah.
That was a shocker.
There's
really.
also that terrific book by Lyndall Roper called The Holy Household.
Absolutely.
Where she talks about the Lutheran Reformation in Germany liking the new gender ideals of that. But that's another story.
Oh, yeah, that's for the next book.
Yeah. So tell us about the discovery, that you loved the most, that you wrote about in here.
Actually, the trigger point was the Burqa Warrior.
I wondered if it might be.
It was. It was a real moment for me because when it happened, 2017, this brilliant team, led by women, yes, but incredibly sophisticated technology, and they released their findings, and it went viral on social media, and this team were hounded into basically becoming hermits. They were so vilified and attacked for the suggestion that this was a woman in this grave, that the lead archaeologist actually, removed themselves from society. They were that attacked. And the social media outpouring was awful. It was, women can do a lot of things, but they cannot fight. I mean, in
2017,
anyway,
yeah.
And by this point, of course, Jane, I'd written 2 books set in the Viking period where the lead protagonist was a warrior woman.
Yes.
And I'd spent so much of my academic career researching the myths, the stories, the art, the environment. The Osberg ship, the biggest Viking ship ever discovered, has 2 women in the middle of it, in a marital bed. And and the fluidity is everywhere in the stories. One of the most famous Old Norse stories is the story of Thor and the wedding, where he dresses up in a wedding dress and pretends to be the goddess Freya so that he can marry the king of the giants and get his hammer back. And there's no and in this myth, it's such a basic thing that we take for granted. But Thor is and Loki, his brother, they're so scared of talking to Freya because she is fierce. She leads the Valkyries. She is a warrior. And when they ask her, will you please marry the king of the giants so I can get my hammer back? She shakes the building with her fury. And they just sort of creep out and go, fine, it's all right, I'll just put on a dress and do it myself, it's fine. And I mean, that is such an empowering story. So I was furious when this team got this backlash in 2017. Basically, I'd been saying it my whole career, that there were women that would have wielded. Imagine it, in Scandinavia, one of the problems there is the climate. And the landscape. That's with all the fjords, it's hard to get from A to B over land, hence why they become such incredible shipbuilders. But at the same time, there are periods in the year in parts of Scandinavia where nothing will grow. And you have no crops, no animals to survive through the winter. So that's why they become such great raiders. That's why they go out and do what they do, and we have the Viking Age. But in that world, imagine it, you've got a village with maybe 10, 15, 20 people. You have resources that you're trying to protect. You have people in a neighbouring village who'd quite like to get their hands on those resources, who will probably come and try and take them. Are you really going to say, when you have 2 children, one a boy and one a girl, no, you can defend us, but you can't? It's all hands on deck in those sorts of communities. And this is something that I think you really see in their world. It's a world untouched by the Romans as well, remember, because that sense of civilization, civitas, city dwelling, it doesn't get up into Germany and into Ireland and into Scandinavia. So you see a different way of society living alongside nature, and you see different gender roles. It's almost like the more you civilize people, the more you put people in cities and restrict them with institutions, the greater that gender divide becomes. And women get the rough end of the stick there.
Interesting, yeah. So there's the DNA.
Yes.
What sort of other things that, discoveries, new technologies, what else has helped change our picture of history? Give us another.
Oh, well,
example.
the final chapter in the book, I always say, please keep reading, because I deliberately kept the last one as sort of a secret boom chapter. And that was a really big one, because those discoveries that I'm talking about were only 2022, and that was as this was
Tell them in case they haven't read it.
Out. So the
brief preview. And then you will read it.
I will tell you the loose version so you can read it in more depth. But amazing work being done in the Museum of London. And they had found a Black Death burial pit in Spitalfields. And in this, it's such a precious archaeological resource. I think all this was quite fresh to me as well because of the pandemic, and people were thinking about pandemic studies and how things like plague will have an impact on society. And what I'm extremely aware about in writing history, particularly medieval history, is whoever's name managing to make it to the present day is probably one of the rich, the powerful, the elite, the few. The art that survives tends to be in the hands of the rich, the powerful, the few. The architecture we see, it's not the many, it's the architecture of the rich, the powerful and the few. And written records is where they live, where they inhabit. Archaeology is where we find everyone. But it's with the advances that the technology are allowing us with archaeology now, space archaeology, DNA analysis, and non-invasive archaeology, that's where we're going to start seeing everybody, not just a few. And that excites me. So I wanted to see in the final chapter if I could give a broader view of what it was like to be alive in medieval London. And because as you mentioned, I do kind of go all over the place.
You do,
and
yeah.
I sort of start in England and then I loop back round to England and end up in London again. And in that, there's this new database that's being formulated. And indeed, there's another one with the Wellcome Trust. But this is about isotope analysis, and it's collecting genetic material from ancient bones and teeth from sites all over the world. Sites from different times, different places, and putting that genetic material into an accessible database, which means they can be cross-referenced when new finds are made. And they took this Spitalfield burial site with hundreds of burials. Because it was a Black Death pit, we know it was just over the period of the Black Death, just those 2 years that it was in use. So it's like a time capsule, this grave. And then they ran the data, the DNA of the bones in there. And what came out was really extraordinary because they were able to now do analysis of where people originated. So in that grave, there were at least 5 individuals that were of African descent. There were another few that were from Asian descent, and they were able to show exactly what area they grew up in, if they moved when they were children or if they moved when they were adults, what work they've done, what health issues they've been affected with. So we had this sense of a person coming out from from these developments. And what was amazing was I compared it with the recent London census. And the recent London census of white to non-white in the London population is now 60-40. And in the 14th century in London, the population was 70-30. Barely a difference. It was as cosmopolitan, as diverse, as international then, almost, as it is now. And that was a shocker for me because I think even now when I think myself back into the medieval world, I didn't used to populate it with people of different races and different backgrounds. But now this technology is showing us they've been hidden in plain sight, and the women have been hidden in plain sight. And now, should we not be looking more for, like I say, the everybody rather than the few, and maybe the people who've been excluded from the narratives? They're not there because they've been written out of it. Yeah.
So, that is a phenomenal final chapter. Can we go back to the few just for a minute and to some of the important texts?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about, is it Julian's Revelations of Divine Love? Is it Hildegard of Bingen? Is it Marjorie Kemp? Who is your sort of, can I make you make a choice or not?
Oh, no, it's like choosing between my children. That's really hard. Do you know what? It's like music.
Yes.
I like each of them in different ways at different times.
Yes.
So when I'm looking for somebody real and raw and annoying and frustrating and brilliantly weird, I want Marjorie.
Yes.
I want her. When I am looking for steady consolation, for that sense that, no matter what life throws at you, just keep loving, keep being good, keep being kind, that's when I turn to Julian. And when I want to just think you can do anything, you can be anything you want, I think of Hildegard.
Yep.
She is utterly extraordinary in terms of what she achieved. And again, I think there's a real danger in history books of exceptionalism, that you take an exceptional figure and just sort of telescope them out of their world as if they are some lone genius that's floating around in a vacuum. But what I think is so extraordinary about the women I find is they are enmeshed in these complex societies. And it's the men and the women around them that are making their exceptionalism possible, if you like. So Hildegard is facilitated by a host of extraordinary people. And she is in the middle of this vibrant world. You know, she's got the ear of the Emperor Barbarossa. She's got the ear of the Pope. She's got the kings and queens of Europe. She's writing advice and criticism to them. She's haranguing the emperor and the bishops and the popes, telling them that they need to do this differently, that they need to, the crusades are going on at this point as well. And she's this sort of radical liberal in the middle going, you know, don't treat the Jews badly, that be more tolerant, don't behave in this sinful, godless way, be more thoughtful, be more cerebral. So, and then she creates these spaces. And if I had to go to one space in my book, I would go to Eibingen, I would go to Hildegard's monastery in Eibingen. Not only that, I've been to her Disibodenberg monastery, and that was the most profound trip I've ever had. But just the idea of being there with those brilliant women. Yeah. And it's a celebration of womanhood in this place. They've got paintings, pictures, murals on the wall of other brilliant saints and women, musicians and artists and poets. And then they're building all this intellect, and she's writing at a rate of knots. The amount of text that Hildegard produces is extraordinary. Science books, medicine, herbals, but then philosophy, and then she writes poetry and plays and music. I mean, she's so prolific. And so I can't help but sort of think she inspires me to be bigger and better than I think I can be.
Wonderful. So those three texts are also interesting because early to mid 20th century women basically either recovered them or identified them, or so Julian's Revelations of Divine Love, a very wonderful woman we've both written about called Grace Warwick, who is a Scottish Presbyterian independent scholar, produces the first modern edition of Revelations
Amazing
of Divine
woman.
Love. And it's the book everyone really reads until a Penguin Classic in the 1960s.
Never been out of print.
No, amazing.
Her version, never been out of print since she first translated it.
And then the story of the discovery of the complete text of Marjorie Kemp is rather wonderful in that it's this colonel in a, should I tell the story?
Yeah, please.
Colonel in a Roman, he's a Roman Catholic, he's in his house in the Midlands, and he wants to play ping pong, and he's like, oh, all these old papers, this is a nuisance, and what are we going to do with them? Because I want to play ping pong and I can't find my ping pong bats. I might have to burn these, put them on the bonfire. Well, fortunately, there's someone in the house that weekend who's like, maybe not. And it is women who identify it. It's he goes, first of all, to the great scholar of mysticism, Evelyn Underhill, and she says, I know the woman who could identify this. And it's an American independent scholar who happens to be in London called Hope Emily Allen. And so women have been, I think that's a story too about how women have been building knowledge of medieval women in the early 20th century so that the life of Marjorie Kemp can be properly identified. And then do you want to tell the story of Daring Do and the rescue of Hildegard of Bingham's?
The rescue of Hildegard's book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Jane, and I was lucky enough to, in fact, I put this dress on today and I realised this was the dress I'm wearing in the documentary I made on Julian of Norwich.
It's a lovely,
it's
a
kind of
wonderful documentary.
Like a flashback.
Yeah.
And in that documentary, it was exactly that story. It was women saving women. And it was this idea of, it was actually Thomas More's granddaughters that ferret out this dangerous book in many ways. You know, Julian is not unorthodox, but she flies close to the edges. And she is living this life off an anchoress. She's enclosed in a room. How does this book get out of this room?
Yep.
You know, it's a potentially dangerous book.
Yeah.
So what gets that book out of this sealed room over to France to the point where, Grace is able to translate it into the 20th century? I find that an absolute mystery. And so we tried to unpack it in the programme. And I think this idea of women trying to preserve those pieces against the odds. And here, time and again, it reminds us, time and again, history has been rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And these things, which we should treasure, books, they are vulnerable. Yeah. They burn, they get destroyed, they get removed. And that's the only way that these words and these lives survive in these fragile, mobile objects. And so to get them when they survive, it is an extraordinary moment. But what I think it reminds us, with Marjorie in particular, but Marjorie's was so accidental. It was just shoved in this cupboard, and it was thanks to the Butler Bowdens that they were this Roman Catholic family that had kind of snuck out certain things from the monasteries. They're just think how many did exist. Exactly. Just think of the tens of thousands of books written by women that did exist.
But we don't know about.
And we don't know about.
They got destroyed.
Well, FEMINA.
Yeah, exactly. One very quick question, and I think we should open it up to questions from the audience. Final sort of note on what do you think, I mean, because you talk a bit about the arts and women as patrons of the arts and jewellery and tapestries. What does that tell us about the period and women?
I think actually one of my favourite chapters in the book is on the Bayeux tapestry, and it was really fun writing that. And actually it's had the biggest impact among medievalists. It's the one I get asked about most, is because, I don't know about you, I did A-level medieval history, and we had to do 1066, and we read all of the sources, Aldrich Vitalis, and we would compare our Anglo-Saxon sources with our Norman sources and peel them apart and look for bias, and find out what these three men are doing, fighting. And the Bayeux tapestry was just sort of thrown in there as another source. Yeah. Very much as a written source, almost. What's going on in the Bayeux tapestry and how does it relate to the texts? And in the many years I've been teaching art history, I needed to go back to this and keep reminding myself, this is an artwork, an extraordinary, unparalleled, exceptional artwork. And when I talk about an artwork, I talk about the artists. Who are the artists? Women embroiderers. Yeah. And yet this was such a no-brainer. Yeah. But in the thousands of articles and books written about the Bayeux tapestry, it barely warrants a mention. And I just thought, okay, let's frame up differently. Like I said in my reading at the beginning, if I put the frame on the women, how does this object talk to me differently? How does it explain this story differently? And my goodness, what you end up seeing is out of this 600 plus men fighting and running around doing man things, there are 3 women, and they come at 3 points, almost at separation points. They're like pauses in the narrative. And there's only one that we can identify absolutely, which is Queen Edith, the Queen of Edward the Confessor. And I do make the claim, I'm writing another book, and in that I think I know where it was made, and I think we have a different story, which again, all of this has just come out of my research for writing this. But the punctuation points of these women are so powerful because you have death and grieving and the way that affects women. So with Edith, you can see she's crying and she's wrapped her hair around her and she's lamenting the death of her husband. And it reminds us of the precariousness of women at this point of war. The world does actually turn upside down in this one moment because all this land, the church, the properties of the people, they're all handed over to Normans. And both men and women are having the rug pulled out from underneath their worlds. So that scene reminds us of that. Then there's this weird one, the Algifu scene, where this cleric is reaching through into a space, an enclosed interior space, and touching a woman. And she has a veil on her head, and the posture of this cleric is mirrored in the margins with a naked figure of a man. It's very odd, and we don't know what's going on. I've often said it's like if we had a copy of OK Magazine 1066, we'd know what scandal this was referring to, but we don't. But in fact, but it's clear from this reversal of the naked body that this is about violation. There's a violation of this woman's space. And again, that's another side effect of the battles, that the nunneries, the convents were ripped open and the nuns were forced to marry Norman lords, and there was violence in these spaces. So even though we don't know the exact person, we don't know the exact name, we can use this scene to start thinking differently about the effects of this war. And then the last one, which I find the most upsetting and powerful, is a woman and a child, and they're running away from a pair of soldiers who are burning their house. And again, the way history was taught when I was at school, the way it still gets taught, it's battles and men and names and dates and this great man's done this battle and what does the battlefield look like and where do they move? Military history takes away the pain, the guts, the gore, the suffering, the broader social impacts. And by looking for the women, all of that in the Bayeux tapestries suddenly just comes screaming out that yes, this is about the glory and the victory, and haven't they done well, the Normans, in this battle? But then there's these moments that these embroiderers have managed to get in that are powerful and profound and moving. So that's why I think looking for the women kind of brought out something different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And I do think you're absolutely right. And I think we can't, this is why I say in this book, this is just a little book. It's just my little contribution out there in the world. But collectively, building a world that is fairer, that does see this inequality, that does see injustices and calls them out, I think is key to how we move forward. And, you know, I would like to think that things would be done differently now. I don't know. Now, interestingly, if you look at Opus Anglicanum, which is the English work that was it begins, I mean, there's a reason that we still have in the House of Lords a wool sack. And that's because wool has been the very beating heart of England's economy forever, really. And this raw material, which was taken out to other places, traded, particularly in the Low Countries, that's really what the whole empire is founded on. But then that also meant that within the British Isles, this tradition of embroidery and tapestry and the making of fabrics and materials was something that became very prized. So Opus Anglicanum, English work, was desired across the known world. And there's instances of English work in the Vatican, particularly. The Vatican loved it and bought as much as they could. And actually now there are examples that survive where we do know some of the names. So, for example, there's a royal princess who has signed the cope in the Cuthbert Treasures in Durham. So we know the object, we know the person it was for, and we know who did it. So there are few and far between, but they are, again, a bit like books, an indicator of how many things we've lost. The fact that one thing survives. We really do have, I hate to kind of be angry at the classical tradition, but we've inherited so much from the classical world and the classical way of thinking about civilization. And indeed, in the 18th, 19th century, you can even see it in the modelling of Washington, this idea that classical is best, classical is right. Part of that is the three graces of painting, sculpture and architecture. And that is still the bane of my work as an art historian, because I work with metalwork, jewellery, fabric, in carvings. I work in all the other media. And why do we prize those three? The medieval world didn't. They had reliquaries and furniture, and things were useful and beautiful. It's the Renaissance that takes us back to this idea of the three graces, and that remains what we inherit going forward in terms of great art. But I think we need to just be doing things differently. I think the reaching out globally is important, because now that we're looking at African art and Mesoamerican art and we're looking at Indian art, we can see civilizations that weren't based on this classical model of the three graces. And so art is becoming more multimedia, but yeah, we still don't pay enough attention or give enough respect to the other arts, particularly fabric. I mean, a way we all define ourselves, how we dress, what we wear, fashion. It's still important. But thank you. I hope I answered that question. I sort of went, wee, and then kind of came back. But thank you. Really great question. Absolutely. Thank you for first, because the way Sarah said the Middle Ages is hundreds and hundreds of years. It's so important that we remember that. And the reason this book is called A New History of the Middle Ages is because we have inherited an understanding of the Middle Ages that has been filtered through post-Reformation lenses. How do you make the Catholic Church and everything it stands for going forward into a Protestant world appear dark, ignorant, brutish, nasty, short? We've inherited that version of the Middle Ages. So it's part of the intent with this book was to rehabilitate our understanding of it and fill it with life and fill it with colour and fill it with complexity. in terms of your question of gradual versus immediate, you're right. But I always say to my students that history isn't about lines in the sand. There's one I tell about the conversion to Christianity, which is everyone didn't go to bed one night thinking it's Odin and wake up going, oh, it's Jesus all along. They're not immediate, and they're not collective. It's gradual. Everything's gradual. And with these dramatic moments, like 1066, it does feel like more of a hiatus because it is war and it is the moment of battle. That has ripple effects, and in courts and in stately homes and in monasteries, it's being felt. Is it being felt in the fields? Is it being felt in Wales? Is it being felt up on the borders? It's all. It's in the instance of 1066. There's definitely something deliberate and immediate, but there's also a legacy. In terms of the role of women, it depends on time and place. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do here. I can't draw you a timeline and say this is where it goes worse and then it all dips off for everybody, because it's not collective. Our experience of the past and our experience of the present isn't collective. So I take you to a specific time and a place and show how in that moment the role of women is evolving. But what is quite noticeable, I'm sure you'll agree with this, Jane, is the impact of the Reformation, because we think of it as a bloody event. For a start, it wasn't. There was only a couple of people killed that we know of, and the Abbot of Glastonbury being one of them. It was, again, slow. There were too many religious houses, too many orders, too many people coming out of the workplace, out of generating income and economics and going into these religious spaces, and a lot of money was being concentrated in them and a lot of power was being concentrated in them. So there's a sort of economic reason, I suppose, for why the monasteries were closed. And we know certainly that was one of the motivations for Henry VIII, was to take the money of the monasteries and put it back in royal hands. But the effect was that all of the monastic houses with men in them, the men of those monasteries were given a number of options. One was that they could take a pension and retire. One was that they could move into the Church of England and take up a position within the new church.
As a priest.
As a priest.
If they were ordained, yeah.
As a priest. Or they could go back into normal society, into working. For the women, there was no option. They were closed. And the closing of those convents meant there were no more of these vibrant intellectual powerhouses for women to learn and be in. And then we get the Protestant tracts that do stress that we are now creating domestic spheres that are manned by women. There's a very kind of clear set of guidance. Martin Luther is really clear on it. Men go out into the world and do things, women stay in the house. So it's both gradual and sudden, in that, if that makes sense. Like the effects getting to it were gradual, and then what happens at that point feels, to me at least, quite sudden.
I think it varies over time and place, obviously.
Yeah.
So it's the Protestant Reformation that does that, and that some nuns resist in parts of Europe. Of course. And then, of course, some parts remain Roman Catholic, and then you have big, powerful women like Teresa of Avila. So it varies across time again. So I think I agree with Janina that it's hard to say this is when these things happen, although it's very tempting to want to say that.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Jane, and that's what the next book is doing, is looking at these women and how the place that you are in is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And what's happening in Italy is completely different to what's happening in the Low Countries, and that's different to what's happening in England. But I would say it struck me, working on the English chapters, that seemed to be quite a critical moment for the role of women. Thank you. I mean, could we have had a better last question? That's so inspiring and so exciting. Now, both of them were supposed to be in either my first or my second book, but I had to cut them. Fredsworth in particular, I'm devastated I couldn't kind of make her work in the story that I was telling in the last book. You're absolutely right. And I mean, in the next book I'm writing about Godiva, another example of women with land, with power, with influence. I mean, with Godiva, she's one of the only women who is recorded in Domesday as still having some of the biggest land ownership in the country. And it's not just 1 or 2 places. This is counties and numerous abbeys and churches and buildings and palaces. And you just think, yeah, they're there. And again, you know, I think that was a brilliant example, because it's just, we should be hearing about their stories. And I will just finish with that thing. When I ask people, have you heard of King Offa? You'll get a room of historians and they'll go, oh, yes, Offa's Dyke, yes, him. Have you heard of Kynethryth? No, who? They ruled as a dual monarchy, and if anything, she was the public face of that royal house. She's on the coins, she's the one involved in the diplomacy, and yet we don't remember her name. And it's the same with all of these women. You know, why can't we shout about them? We should be allowed to shout about them. Thank you. That was fantastic.
So thank you, Janina. Thank you.